Dr. Britta Meiers Carlson completed her BA at Concordia College, her MDiv at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. She is a Lutheran, but we forgive her for this. And she's just defended her PhD this year from Boston University. Her thesis entitled The Suffering Other, Citizenship, Race, and Ecclesial Identity in the Church's Witness Among Immigrant Communities. So this is wonderfully right in her area of specialty. Britta has, throughout her academic career, also worked as a Lutheran pastor. She was ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in 2015, so 10 years. Mm-hmm. Wow, at the same time. And she currently serves as a visiting instructor in practical theology at the School of Theology, and we are very grateful to have her. So thank you, everybody, and I'll turn it over to Britta.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to Dean Mattis for the invitation to speak to you this evening, to Dean Terrell as well. And I want to also make sure to thank the staff. I know that these events are a lot of work for University and School of Theology staff, so thank you so much for your dedication in supporting this event. I'm honored by all of you choosing to spend your evening here, whether in person or online, to learn something about a topic that I think is on a lot of people's conscience right now. So without further ado, I'll present to you this lecture on sanctuary and citizenship. In 2006, Elvira Arellano, an immigrant from Mexico, took sanctuary in her church, the Adalberto United Methodist Church in Chicago. Her decision provided a unifying theological image for a diverse group of religious activists who were searching for a coordinated response to hateful and violent rhetoric on and assaults on the well-being of immigrant communities during that time. Escalating deportations, highly publicized immigration raids, and proposed legislation that would have further criminalized immigrants and their advocates swayed the public conversation about migrants in the United States. Sounds a little familiar. A particularly divisive move by the legislature was a bill, H.R. 4437, which was passed by the House of Representatives in December of 2005, but never by the Senate. Also known as the Sensenbrenner Bill, it would have made felons of all undocumented immigrants living in the United States and increased penalties against those who gave aid that might help them to remain in the country. Many in the church experienced these efforts in contrast with the values they associated with God's vision for the world. In a 2006 interview on the eve of Ash Wednesday, Cardinal Roger Mahoney decried the bill, noting that according to extreme interpretations of the proposed law, the church would have to ask for immigration papers before allowing someone to participate in the sacraments. He called on Roman Catholics to serve everyone regardless of immigration status. And with these words, the cardinal challenged the state's authority to determine the bonds of belonging and citizenship, evoking the church's own definitions of membership. Mahoney's public, faith-rooted stance is remembered alongside Elvira Arellano's decision to take sanctuary as a galvanizing moment that awakened the moral imagination of the country. On May 9th, 2007, which was the same day that the unsuccessful Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act was introduced onto the floor of the US Senate, faith leaders from Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, San Diego, and Seattle held joint press conferences announcing a rebirth of the 1980s sanctuary movement. We have arrived at another challenging moment for immigration activism of all stripes in the United States of America. For decades, those who support a more humanitarian approach have been advocating for this elusive dream of comprehensive immigration reform. Yet even when policymakers give some lip service to the desire for such reform, the system has become increasingly entrenched in exclusionary practices that are supported by a narrative that immigrants are dangerous, criminal, and threatening to the values that unite US society. This has been a trend since at least the 1980s, when my research picks up the story, although there's a sufficient research by historians and social theorists to evoke confidence that this has been a tendency for most of our history. This nation of immigrants also defines itself against the immigrant. In the church, we have a different narrative about immigrants and also about our identity as Christians, whether or not we are citizens of the United States. The call to heavenly citizenship is one that resonates from deep within Christian tradition, evoked by thinkers like as far back as Augustine and even in the New Testament. It provides a framework that has been deployed within faith-based immigrant rights activism in the United States as a call to solidarity across lines of nationality. In response to intensifying nationalism and a rising awareness about racism, Christian immigration activists in the new sanctuary movement are continually reimagining relationships across citizenship lines, developing practices that are intended to check power within their movement and the privilege they have as citizens beyond it. In this lecture, I'll share with you some of these practices, drawing from both textual data on sanctuary and on my ethnographic research on the new sanctuary movement. I argue that the performance of citizenship among sanctuary activists mounts a powerful challenge to societal narratives that justify the violent exclusion of immigrants. And I'll begin with a summary of sanctuary activism from the 1980s through the early 2000s, with a focus on some of the theological insights that have emerged from that movement. I'll then shift to some of the more recent developments in ecclesial sanctuary, especially during the first Trump administration, and in view of the national conversation about the relationship between race and power that was prevalent during that same period. My analysis suggests that to live a life of solidarity with immigrants makes a strong claim about the identity of heavenly citizens and citizens of the United States. Extending neighborly love to one who was never supposed to be the neighbor in the eyes of the world pulls the rug out from under exclusionary narratives about immigrants. And while I can't say yet how this second Trump administration is shaping sanctuary patterns, and to be sure I am paying attention, I'll end my lecture today with a few themes and questions that I believe are important for us to hold in mind during this time. There is one aspect of sanctuary that I want to make sure to highlight before we talk about what I am clearly framing here as a church-state contest. Sanctuary has become quite a buzzword in the last decade or so, and I attribute this to both a rise in sanctuary city policies and the total repudiation of those policies by the political right. And we're seeing this tension big time in the clashes right now in Los Angeles. So these policies often uphold a longstanding tension between the national government and state and local governments. And they're a response to immigration strategies that became very popular in the post-9/11 era, strategies like the 287G program that encourages cooperation between local law enforcement agencies and US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Here in Tennessee and in many other places, we're seeing a flurry of new 287G agreements right now in the United States. My focus in this lecture is on ecclesial sanctuary, that is, sanctuary that's practiced by Christian congregations, denominations, and faith-based organizations. Though this work is often done in collaboration with interreligious and secular networks of activists. The reason I single out ecclesial sanctuary, besides my own identity as a Christian, is that I agree with an assessment by Roman Catholic theologian Leo Guardado that the ecclesiological roots of sanctuary make it intelligible even when it is practiced by an avowedly secular government. Sanctuary emerges from within the life of the church. The church shares its theological imagination with actors outside of it who claim common cause with non-citizens. So while sanctuary city policies may be something that Christians want to support, if we only understand it as a strategic means to a political end, we miss out on an opportunity to learn about our identity as Christians living in the world and unto love for God and neighbor. So I invite you into this story of ecclesial sanctuary with the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. How many of you are familiar with this movement or have encountered it? Yeah, a few of you out there. So this movement arose in response to a flow of migrants coming from Central America, especially from El Salvador and Guatemala. Civil wars had resulted in massive displacement, with an estimated 500 to 750,000 people seeking refuge in the United States. The government declined to designate those coming to the southern border as refugees or political asylees, classifying them instead as economic migrants and targeting them for deportation. This inspired outrage among migrants and their advocates. In particular, there were many who felt that the Cold War era foreign policies of the United States were partly to blame for the violence in Central America, and believed that the US had a moral obligation to address the suffering and persecution of the displaced. On March 24th, 1982, the second anniversary of the assassination of Oscar Romero, several US congregations, including the Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona, and their pastor, the Reverend John Fief, as well as several congregations in the East Bay area of California, publicly announced that they would be sanctuaries for Central Americans seeking asylum in the United States. These declarations did not emerge out of a vacuum. Sanctuary is a well-established tradition in the church with precedents in the Old Testament. In Numbers 35, the Torah establishes that there shall be 6 cities of refuge to provide a place for those accused of manslaughter to await trial, and if found guilty, to live in until the death of the high priest, which atoned for their guilt. We read about this also in Deuteronomy and Joshua. The link between the guilt of the sanctuary recipient and the atonement that's offered in the death of the priest is a basis for Moshe Greenberg's argument that these places of refuge were, in the imagination of Israel, connected to holiness. The cities, which interrupted cycles of violence, were to be established on the territories of the Levites, of the priestly tribe. Local altars could also provide a place of refuge until such time as the accused could be escorted safely to a city of refuge. The church would appropriate this link between holiness and refuge in its ministry of sanctuary, expanding beyond manslaughter to provide protection for punishment for people accused of a variety of crimes, whether or not there was reason to believe they had committed them. The first reference we have to ecclesial sanctuary comes from the Council of Serdica in 343 as a way of providing structural support for bishops who had been deposed by followers of Arius following the development of the Nicene Creed. Any presbyter who was unjustly expelled from a church in one city was to be allowed to remain in the city where they fled. Canon 8 of the Council also states that a bishop should make intercession for those who are oppressed by the disadvantages in life, the afflicted widow or exploited orphans. And the canon goes on, since it often happens that those who suffer a wrong or who are offenders are condemned to exile or an island, or at any rate receive some sentence, flee to the mercy of the church. They are to be given relief, and forgiveness is to be asked for them without hesitation. Ecclesial sanctuary has come to mean many different things through time. Sometimes the church's sanctuary practices are carried out in opposition to government, especially if the church feels that the government is acting unjustly. At other times, when the church and state are more in step, sanctuary can be carried out in a more collaborative way as a sort of alternative sentencing structure. But always, the idea of God's mercy and the church's participation in it is central in the practice of sanctuary. We find a compelling reference to this in Gregory of Nazianzus' funeral oration for Basil of Caesarea, wherein he tells the story of a time Basil offered sanctuary to a woman who was fleeing from a judge. Gregory insists that to stand aside and allow the judge to take the woman away would make of Basil and all Christians traitors to their own laws. Commenting on this passage, Leo Guardado asserts that sanctuary practices are the church's affirmation of both the sacramental presence of God at the altar of mercy and the faith of the one who seeks it. The church is not to interfere with God's sacramental work of mercy. I would love to go on and on about this theological narrative of sanctuary in Christian tradition. If you're interested in learning more, there's a great book by Linda Rabin called Sanctuary and Asylum, A Social and Political History. It's just a good read. In any case, the theological imagination for the church as a place that offers mercy to those who have been condemned by the laws of the world was active at the time the Central American refugees were seeking safety in the United States. There had been an active network of sanctuary churches assisting people avoiding the draft during the Vietnam War. And included among those were several of the East Bay congregations that participated in that original sanctuary declaration. Meanwhile, Jim Corbett, a lay Quaker and rancher living in Tucson, Arizona, had been organizing a community of friends and acquaintances on both sides of the border to discreetly shelter Central Americans in churches and private homes, assisting them on their journey through the borderlands and onto other parts of the United States. This network has been likened to an underground railroad that assisted formerly enslaved people to evade capture in the slave states. Leaders from the sanctuary movement's founding years framed the decision to move away from this more clandestine strategy and make public declarations of sanctuary as a challenge to the government's desire to keep the realities of the Central American refugee situation hidden from public view. They believed that if the population of the United States knew what was happening in Central America, they could sway public opinion and secure refugee status for the migrants in the eyes of the law. The public sharing of migrant testimonios, stories of persecution, torture, and rape in ascending countries became a prominent strategy for the sanctuary movement. The underground work of sanctuary did continue in the shadow of this more public-facing approach, and that ongoing effort is well documented in the work of Hillary Cunningham. The public sanctuary churches and volunteers engaged in a variety of activities in solidarity with the Central American migrants. In addition to offering housing to migrants who were in physical sanctuary, they also publicly advocated for changes to US immigration policy. Sanctuary activists held ecumenical prayer services and public vigils in response to atrocities in Central America. They sold crafts and literature from the region and traveled in delegations to war-torn areas to meet with the displaced and learn more about the conditions there. Citizen participants are also known to have assisted migrants in finding paid work and in some instances offering them employment. One consuming activity for the movement was coordinating transportation to move migrants from the border states where they first arrived to other parts of the United States. And this becomes important because although the movement eventually grew to include more than 400 congregations, most of the scholarship on the sanctuary movement tends to focus on the founding clusters of sanctuary congregations in Tucson, San Francisco, and the East Bay, but also some congregations in Chicago who were charged with coordinating transportation of migrants throughout the United States. The history of the movement is complex. What I'd really like for you to take away from this presentation about the sanctuary movement are some of the key frameworks for its contest with the government that I think we continue to wrestle with today. The sanctuary movement is often associated with the political left and socialist movements in Latin America. However, a well-documented conflict within the movement, which was most apparent in tensions between the folks in Tucson and the Chicago activists, shows that the complexity of secular politics is not quite as straightforward as we'd like to think. The Chicago group felt that the movement should not provide supports to migrants who were affiliated with the political right in Central America. This perspective came from a commitment within Latin American liberation theology that it wouldn't be possible to defeat the oppressor without first describing the historical realities that contributed to that oppression. Tucson, on the other hand, took a more humanitarian approach, expressing a desire to aid anyone fleeing the violence in Central America, regardless of political affiliation. Despite the internal nature of this conflict, the US government used the perception of leftist radicalism to characterize the movement as an illegal, politically motivated smuggling ring rather than as a religious movement, in an attempt to avoid setting up a state-church conflict that might govern public sympathies for the sanctuary workers. From the time of the public declarations of sanctuary, the Immigration and Naturalization Service undertook surveillance of the network, escalating to a full-blown infiltration by undercover agents known as Operation Sojourner in 1984. Following these investigations, the government indicted 14 sanctuary workers on charges of conspiracy and alien smuggling in January of 1985. Many undocumented Central Americans were also detained in that sweep. The agents had infiltrated a Bible study for the refugees and targeted the participants for deportation. While charges were eventually dropped or reduced against some of the sanctuary workers, 11 of them went to trial and 8 were convicted. The Tucson trials produced a tension we continue to debate in the public conversation today about whether sanctuary activities are political or religious in nature. I would argue that they are both. The sanctuary activists were prevented from arguing that their activities were protected by the First Amendment when their case went to trial, which proved detrimental to their chances in court. The judge was not convinced that there were doctrinal reasons for the sanctuary movement and categorized their activism as a matter of personal conscience rather than as an expression of any shared religious conviction. It's noteworthy that the judge and many of the prosecutors and INS agents involved in the trial identified as Christian and asserted obedience to the law as a Christian obligation, complicating attempts to characterize the trial as an example of the government persecuting the church. Ironically, the government also relied on materials produced by the rival Chicago group to demonstrate the nature of sanctuary work as political rather than as religious, in its case against the Tucson workers. Although they lost in the court of law, the sanctuary movement was victorious in the court of public opinion, which is exactly what the government had hoped to avoid. Following the trials and the convictions, public sympathy for the workers grew immensely, and so did sanctuary participation. So in April of 1985, the network had about 226 sites throughout the country. By June of 1987, that number had risen to 399. While the movement continued to ebb and flow in the years that followed, it dwindled significantly following a victory in a civil suit, American Baptist Churches et al. Versus Thornburg. The suit argued that the Reagan administration's unwillingness to consider the asylum claims for applicants from Guatemala and El Salvador violated the US Refugee Act of 1980. When the government began to suspect it would lose the case, it agreed to a settlement that resulted in a reconsideration of asylum claims for the migrants. That same year, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1990 and created a new category that we now know as temporary protected status to provide humanitarian relief for the migrants by deferring deportation. While the legacy of TPS is mixed, most sanctuary workers at the time saw it as a victory and a vindication, leading to a pause in national coordination of sanctuary work among religious immigration activists. Now we'll get to some theology. The work of these sanctuary activists is significant as we seek to understand what the church is and how it functions in relationship to the US government. Hilary Cunningham, not a theologian, but an anthropologist, highlights the ecclesiological significance of sanctuary for us in describing an underground church that produces a transnational identity within a global and globalizing community of practice. She writes, the transnational dimension of religious identity in such movements as sanctuary reflects a distinct conceptualization of what a church in both the local and global expression is or should be. Leo Guardado explores the significance of such a sanctuary ecclesiology, beginning with the assertion I shared with you a moment ago about sanctuary as an expression of the church's mercy. He argues that the post-Vatican II church understands that this mercy is found not only at the altar, but is also incarnated within the body of Christ. Understood through the lens of sanctuary, The sanctuary movement was not only about lending aid to Central American refugees, but also about healing the church in the United States from its complicity with institutions of violence. The incarnational practice of sanctuary is a constructive space for discerning what it means to be the people of God as the church grapples in its relationship with the rest of humanity. According to Guardado, sanctuary ministry in the 1980s was not a means to a political end, but a practice that emerges from within the nature of the church and a way of being for a church that lives in an imagination beyond the dehumanizing conditions of a bordered global society. This bears significance in our discernment about what it means to be a Catholic church. Our Catholicity, our universality, is not merely expressed by simply being diverse or even by living that diversity out interpersonally. It is also about offering the world an imagination for a citizenry that transcends borders. To be a member of God's heavenly city challenges a worldview that requires the sacrifice of certain kinds of people for the preservation of other kinds. And a church that strives to embody God's politics is a church that's firmly planted in a geographic location and which offers the mercy and hospitality it has come to know in its communion with Jesus to all whom it encounters, regardless of the world's narratives that seek to separate light-skinned from dark-skinned and citizen from non-citizen. These contributions that come to us from the faithfulness of sanctuary recipients and activists in the 1980s are invaluable as we discern our witness in an environment that has only strengthened in its vitriol against immigrants. Of course, no practice of the church is flawless, and some scholars have raised concerns about the power dynamics that prevailed within the 1980s movement. In a recent qualitative study, theologian Michael Wolff highlights the challenge of a movement that sought liberation for immigrants through political means, requiring political strategies that were at times harmful to the migrants. As I noted earlier, a core practice of sanctuary was the public sharing of testimonies about persecution, torture, and rape. Wolff attributes this practice to the expectation that migrants contribute to the effort by convincing the government and the public that they met the legal definition of a refugee by performing in the role of a refugee. Some migrants found that when they shared their stories of suffering, there was an expectation that they include affective displays of fear and grief for their audience. While it seems that these emotional presentations may have been effective in garnering sympathy for the migrants and to sway public opinion, fear marked the recipients as other to the communities they inhabited. And so when the recipients put on this performance, it made it less likely that the citizen sanctuary activists would view them as leaders in their own movement. This was despite the reality that many of them had been leaders in Central America, which is why they had to flee in the first place. And many of them were kind of carrying out leadership capacities concurrently with their time in sanctuary. But this was not often recognized by the movement. These performances of suffering also hid any political motivations the recipients may have had that differed from the centralized motivations of the movement itself. So Wolff identifies two primary consequences of this strategy. The first is that by trying to cast the sanctuary recipients as refugees, the movement undermined its own goals in the long term by reproducing the logic of the immigration system it sought to critique. Rather than redefining who the migrants were in the eyes of society, the sanctuary movement cast them in the role according to contemporary laws and norms. The second consequence is more overtly theological. Wolff argues that when recipients of sanctuary put on this performance of the victim, it provided not only recruitment opportunities, but also material for theological reflection, contributing to self-actualization and the emergence of new identities for the citizen activists. He writes, conceived of as closer to God due to their suffering, white religious liberals were happy to use recipients as sources of knowledge for their own spiritual advancement. With this, Wolff warns churches and sanctuary activists of the potential danger in using narratives of redemptive suffering, even when those narratives are meant to deconstruct violent political systems. So I give you that background because these dynamics bubbled up in the early years of the new sanctuary movement, or the NSM, which is where I'm going to shift our attention now. So the political conditions that gave rise to the NSM were quite different from those of the sanctuary movement. Discourses about the threats of immigration evolved dramatically in response to the September 11th, 2001 attacks and the US war on terror. In response, NSM strategies often strive to depict immigrants not as other, but as non-threatening ordinary neighbors who live side by side with US citizens. This is a phenomenon that political theorists have labeled cultural citizenship. While undocumented migrants might not be legal citizens, the NSM insists that they belong, that there is something of a shared identity at work in the relationship. A dimension of the NSM that is essential to understand is that it's not centrally organized in the same way the sanctuary movement was in the 80s. It started out that way. When sanctuary was declared in 2007, there were national conferences of the NSM. There was a coordinated effort to lobby Congress on comprehensive immigration reform. But since the last time this reform was debated in Congress, and in 2013 now, it's been a while, the NSM has both diffused and also proliferated in other ways. Even as more coordinated efforts at legal change have given way, new local networks that use the language of sanctuary have been popping up all over, and many of them emerged in response to the anti-immigrant vitriol of the first Trump administration. So sanctuary has also become more mainstream during this period. My own denomination, the ELCA, declared itself a sanctuary denomination in 2019. That's pretty mainstream, right? So in my work, I treat sanctuary as a discourse. It can refer to a discrete set of practices, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But sanctuary often in the United States functions as a rhetorical signal. The language of sanctuary does a lot of work for us and holds sway in the public imagination. When I refer to the NSM, I'm talking about organizations and networks that either came out of that 2007 sanctuary declaration or that have since adopted the language of new sanctuary. In the NSM, publicly declared sanctuary is a political and legal tactic. In recent years, when an undocumented immigrant took sanctuary, that is, when they moved into the property that belonged to a faith community, that individual was encouraged to speak out publicly, not to hide. The courageous choice by an undocumented immigrant to emerge from the shadows has been a central narrative in the post-9/11 immigrants' rights discourse. It's a way of declaring one's belonging in the United States, despite the means that were used to enter the country, thereby challenging restrictive immigration laws and border policies. In the NSM network where I undertook my research, willingness to speak publicly about one's case was a requirement for someone to enter sanctuary. And when a migrant went into sanctuary, it was announced in an almost celebratory manner with press releases and public rallies. The public nature of sanctuary is a tactic the NSM uses to claim that its activities are perfectly legal, right? We're no longer smuggling because the government knows right where this person is. That tactic has actually never been tested in court. and we'll see. That court challenge could be coming before too long. Physical sanctuary tends to draw a lot of attention from movement activists and also from scholars and the media, but it's only a very small part of the everyday activities of people involved in sanctuary work. While activities vary dramatically from one local network to the next, some expressions of solidarity with immigrants found throughout the NSM include citizen accompaniment to immigration check-ins and other court appearances. There are detention center visitation programs, rapid response networks to show up in resistance to ICE raids at homes and businesses, know your rights trainings, vigils at detention centers and ICE offices, programs to monitor the treatment of migrants in detention, or efforts to close detention facilities altogether. Some groups are raising funds to provide legal or bond services, and public advocacy for local, state, and national policy changes to benefit migrants continues to be an ongoing preoccupation of sanctuary activists. There is such variety from one network to the next. And there are kind of more centrist networks, often found in red states, where the congregations are focusing on hospitality and relationship building. And then there are networks in places like Chicago and California that are working really closely with Black radical organizations to abolish prisons. So the range is really broad on this. I would be hard pressed to overestimate how complex this movement has become at this point in our history. In recent decades, the face of immigration has also changed. Immigration patterns, as well as increased awareness about racial and cultural biases of immigrant rights work, have expanded the NSM's purview to recognize the plight of Asian and Middle Eastern immigrants, as well as Black immigrants from African and Caribbean countries. Likewise, the movement has become more religiously diverse. While the sanctuary movement was comprised primarily of Christian, Unitarian Universalist, and Jewish congregations, the NSM has, in some localized networks, noticeable involvement from Muslim faith communities, and in some instances, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, and Baha'i communities. All of these dynamics contribute to what I have noted as an increased cultural, racial, and theological humility among sanctuary activists. Academic theology has also done a lot of work to reckon with the harm that can come when its historic theologies of suffering and atonement are assumed without considering how those traditions interact with power and systemic oppression. And I would love to go into lots of detail about that, but that would be a different presentation. But there's been a lot of work among womanist and feminist theologians on that. And if you're in my class, you get to read about it for tomorrow. So all of this has resulted in some intentional changes in NSM practices. The NSM discourages the use of biblical language about welcoming the stranger, as it strives to depict immigrants not as stranger, but as neighbor, as members of the community. It's also moved away from the use of immigrant suffering narratives and victimhood language. When immigrant testimonies are shared within the NSM, they tend to focus on migrants as hardworking, as law-abiding, as loving family units, and immigration law as unnecessary interference in an otherwise peaceful community. The NSM seeks to depict immigrants as non-threatening, ordinary citizens, rather than as radically other refugees who have suffered unimaginable trauma. Claims to cultural citizenship are meant to sway public opinion, advocating that immigration laws should catch up with the lived reality of immigrants and their citizen neighbors. The shift away from the suffering narrative is significant for theology. Many of the NSM activists I interviewed for my study were acutely aware of the potentially harmful effects of using suffering and victimization language in reference to undocumented immigrants in the NSM. Suffering was decentered in favor of rhetoric and practices that promoted agency for the immigrants. Activists did this by avoiding the sensationalization of immigrant suffering and emphasizing other parts of the immigrant story, such as the determination to live, to protect one's children, wisdom, giftedness, and belonging in the community. Emphasis on life rather than on suffering unto death led to a practice of solidarity with immigrants that promoted agency. Interview participants made intentional efforts to avoid associating immigrant suffering with any benefits they might experience in their relationship with them. This was a challenge. It required careful use of language because the folks I was talking to were also acutely aware of the real trauma and real threats to life that people carried. So they responded to this challenge in varying ways. Some of the folks I spoke with avoided discussing the details of any individual experiences of trauma, focusing instead on the more political and systemic causes of suffering. Others insisted that we avoid any, quote, victim language and in reference to immigrants, noting that such a framework can render immigrants as both incapable of participating in their own journey toward liberation and as saintly figures who are not permitted to make mistakes. Many of the folks I interviewed seemed deliberately to be avoiding the subject altogether. Despite hesitancy to discuss suffering directly, there was an overall affirmation among participants that supporting people in sanctuary, in their support of people in sanctuary, they were in solidarity with their efforts to protect their lives and those of their children. They were described as fighters who went to great lengths to secure a more hopeful future. Turning someone away at the door of the church was simply not an option for these folks. One individual I spoke with echoed Gregory of Nazianzus's funeral oration, asserting that to refuse a direct ask for help from someone whose life was endangered would be a betrayal of the church's mission and grounds to close his congregation. Protecting and preserving life was a central commitment of these activists. The kind of life the NSM strives to promote is not merely a life that's the opposite of death. It's a life with dignity. And sanctuary, for many of the volunteers I encountered, is about making life work for undocumented immigrants and accompanying them as they find their voice, advocate for their needs, and figure out how to live in peace in the place of their choice. The organization reminds its members that an immigrant's life does not begin and end when they cross the border. Whatever traumatic events may have occurred resulting in that person becoming undocumented are only one phase of life. Each immigrant, whether in sanctuary or within the broader work of the NSM, brings knowledge, skills, and wisdom to the movement. This approach decenters immigrant experiences of suffering, recontextualizing those experiences in the story of a whole life that includes the unique giftedness of that individual. This rhetorical strategy is intended to disrupt paternalism in immigrant rights work. Sanctuary activists worked tirelessly to put systems in place that would affirm the agency of the migrants in sanctuary. For example, if someone was in sanctuary, no one was permitted to bring them a donation unless they had specifically requested that item. Sanctuary recipients did their own cooking and sought their own volunteers to do grocery delivery to ensure that culturally appropriate ingredients were sourced. When congregation members had complaints or concerns about lifestyle choices of the migrants in sanctuary, leadership from those congregations would encourage them to consider how differences in culture and life experience might be contributing to their displeasure with the situation. Members of sanctuary congregations also reported their delight in participating in cultural and economic exchanges with the migrants and becoming friends with them. In view of our theological work on sanctuary, these structural efforts to cultivate mutuality and interdependence gives us an insight into the nature of heavenly citizenship that's revealed in the practices of the sanctuary church. The world puts labels on people, labels related to the place where we're born or the color of our skin. And heavenly citizenship is not an escape from that. It is instead a call to live more fully in a world in relationships that are marked by differences in power and privilege. A true relational solidarity requires us to face the messiness of that honestly, making mistakes and asking forgiveness. In addition to showing us what it means to love the neighbor in 2025, this way of being with others also provides a strategic contrast from prevailing systems of power that give privilege to some at the expense of others. It's not that the sanctuary church gives up its privilege. I'm not sure that that's entirely possible in our current society. Rather, in seeking to recognize the agency of immigrants, their gifts, their contributions to community and society, new sanctuary activists undermine the logic of the immigration system in prioritizing not only God's mercy, but also the personhood of immigrants. They affirm the image of God they encounter in each precious life. This causes them to live in critical distance from the identity the society foists on them as United States citizens. Rather than cowering in fear from a racialized other whom the government uses to amass its own authority and sovereignty, the sanctuary church chooses friendship and neighborly love. It's a performance that embodies what Elizabeth Stewart might call a parody of US citizenship, by which Christians living in the United States bear witness to the politics of the heavenly city. This is hard interpersonal work with implications for national and global politics. Immigrant sanctuary and accompaniment practices in the United States are undergoing yet another dramatic shift. Some observers are calling for practices to move once again out of the church and out of the public eye, so as to meet immigrants in the places where they are already devising creative strategies for survival. Barbara Andres Ostaita calls this sanctuary everywhere, and it's already a way of being for countless migrants and citizens who are saying no to an ideology of death. It's happening in borderlands, cities, and rural communities. There may be strategic benefits to this approach, and certainly benefits to protect the privacy and security of migrants. There's also a lot of value in that really public work of sanctuary that shows the world, the church's journey toward reciprocal relationship between citizens and non-citizens as a critical challenge to the exclusionary rhetoric that upholds our immigration system. Wherever we may find ourselves in this phase of our nation's history, the church is called to hold fast to its affirmation that God is merciful, that we who are living into this eschatological reality of God's heavenly city are governed by the laws of that mercy, and that the ministry of the church is not to be limited by boundaries and borders that seek to impede the way of love. The sanctuary church reminds us that the whole church is established in the name of the one who came that we might have life and have it abundantly. Thank you. So I don't know if anyone had any questions or comments that they'd like to share. Yes.
Isn't there a certain wrote the book Cast?
Yes.
That talks about this basic bottom.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of disruption is going on? Getting rid of people from Central and South America.
What kind of disruption of
that cast,
of that structure?
If that bottom goes away.
So it's been a few years since I've read Isabel Wilkerson. My response to that would be that I don't think that that bottom is going anywhere. I think that there are some people who would like very much for us to think that they have the capacity to do that. But I think that what we're seeing right now, and that's not to take away from the people who really are affected by these massive deportation raids and that kind of thing. That's very real pain that people are feeling. But I think at the level of kind of the systemic look at the racial hierarchies of the United States, we will always have immigrants. And many of the immigrants who are with us now, legal or undocumented, are going to stay here. Especially what we're seeing right now is that the Trump administration just simply doesn't have the capacity to deport as many people as it claims. So I think that part of my work is looking at the reason that I start with the 1980s is because I want to show how these rhetorical strategies have been building through time, right? In the 1980s, we had the war on drugs, and then it was the war on terror, but always immigrants were associated with criminality, with terrorism, as a way of, and then that was being used to justify new policies related to the immigration system that certainly affected the individuals being evoked by public officials, but they actually affected all immigrants. That was one of the really interesting things I encountered in my research, talking to immigrants from Europe who had to deal with this archaic immigration system that's just full of the worst kinds of bureaucracy and also just really terrible treatment by officials in the system. Yeah, there's a question up there.
I grew up in South Florida, and I'm wondering if in your research, you talk about El Salvador and the Central American countries. Have you made a comparison between their treatment and the treatment of Cubans who, in the different phases and stages of their coming, there was distinct United States policy
Mhm.
in regards to them. I just wondered if in your research you addressed some of that, because you talk about with the Central American and political, but not treating them as political, whereas for Cubans, they're treated very politically. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I don't take up I talk very briefly about the Cuban migrants, but not in the way that you are bringing that in the mix. The way that I don't address them directly, but the way that I address this is by looking at the kind of the racialization of the immigration system, but also the politicization of the immigration system. So migrants at that time, migrants from Central America were often assumed to be leftists, to be socialists, whereas refugees coming from Cuba were framed as being political asylees from a hostile government, right? Which is, I think, what you're raising. Yeah.
Yes, but there was also a racial component to it.
Yes.
As well, as Cuban immigrants were often considered to be at the quote unquote top of the hierarchy.
Right. Yes, I do take that up. not with the Cubans directly, but I look at some of the ways that race is used to justify certain kinds of immigration policies, especially in that post 9/11 era, but also in the 80s. Yeah.
There seems to be tension between the rejection of the idea of work national identity that is and the kind of strategic value of saying, look, they're good contributors to society, they're good people, they're like a value, merit, right? As opposed to the grades that would be sort of, it doesn't matter if they contribute to society,
Yes.
they're just part of
Yes.
Did that tension emerge in sort of the way that you understand?
So it didn't come up as much in the interviews, but there's definitely a lot of analysis of this out there. So one of the main critiques of the New Sanctuary movement, especially in the early years, was the way that it depicted immigrants as, being part of a family unit and being a sort of neighborly person, when in reality, for example, some of you may remember when President Obama had his big announcement about his immigration policy. He basically he says we're deporting felons, not families, right? When in reality, felons are also members of families. So it gets really messy. And again, the New Sanctuary movement has really become so diverse, and you still have some networks that are really into that sort of family first narrative. But there are a lot of other networks who have taken that criticism to heart and are now willing to take folks into sanctuary who do have a criminal record or who are queer, right? And that has been something that's been more recent, because the image of the sanctuary recipient for a long time was like a mother and her kids in sanctuary, and you still have that. But I think that the people receiving sanctuary has also become more diverse in response to some of those criticisms. Yeah.
So I serve a parish in Metro West outside of Boston and Framingham, and my children's school is 53% English as a second language. So we're a highly immigrant community, primarily Brazilian immigrants, and our Church of St. Andrew's, right in the center of Framingham, is home to a mission hub, which is Project Connections, which has become kind of a little oasis for Brazilian immigrants, teaching Portuguese plus to kids so they can talk to grandma and grandpa, ESL classes and citizenship classes. And as it started out as a mission hub in our church, over the years has kind of become two separate communities until recently, when obviously the need is so great to support our immigrant neighbors, that we're trying to finally bridge the gap between the two. But it's very tricky, because I have a good portion, I would say almost the majority of our parishioners who are mostly Anglo, who are ready to, dig in and help, and be supportive of, what they can do to teach, citizenship classes and support the different programs that we have. But I guess my question is, have you talked, for our churches in here and now who I feel are called to take care of people, how we can move these two groups of those who want to be on the front lines and step up as a community of faith, and those who are so hesitant because they don't have the understanding of the fact that ICE needs a warrant with a name on it to enter our church building. Our parishioners are quite grasping that. And I guess the other part of this is just down the street, we have a Brazilian, primarily Brazilian congregation, where we have people driving around on Sunday mornings looking for ICE, calling up ministries to say, hey, there's 2 ICE agents out on your church parking lot. They're not supposed to be there. And the church literally canceling services and going to all Zoom because they're scared. We're losing businesses. We're losing enrollment in school is down because parents are afraid to send their kids to school. My own kids, who are kids of color, have come home bawling and crying because their friends are not in school, and they don't understand why, and they think it can happen to them because they look like their friends. So I guess my question is, with all of this, living into it in the thick of things in an immigrant community, have you done work on educating parishes themselves, Anglican parishes themselves, to understand better how we can support?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I got into this in the first place, because what I was struggling with was, as a church planter of a primarily Spanish-speaking congregation, was like there were these power dynamics within the community that were just seemed impossible to overcome. And so sanctuary actually just becomes a really high energy area to look at this power differential, right, between the white citizen and the immigrant of color who is dependent, right, living in the building of the congregation. So yeah, it's really hard. One of the challenges is that everything is moving very fast right now, and it is hard to know. I just heard, I mean, the movement is playing catch up and is not putting out a lot of advice right now. So one of the things I've just heard is that the Roman Catholic Diocese in Nashville has basically just told people, like, you don't have to come to church, just like giving people permission to stay home, and that's okay. I also like to share the story of a colleague of mine. I don't know if he's still doing it, but he had a ministry in northern Vermont among dairy workers, many of them undocumented, and he was a church planter. And it was within the jurisdiction of U.S. Border Patrol, and Border Patrol would pick people up who were out and about. And so his ministry went to the farms, right? And so I think we need to be real. This is this notion of sanctuary everywhere, right? Thinking creatively about how to meet people pastorally where they are, and being in relationship, I think. I don't want us to go over time too much.
Yeah. Back up. Say something. Send us support. Guys, congratulations. Yes.
Actually,
Should we get rolling?
And now I get to lose
One of the things that's really interesting is, the sanctuary movement, they try to use them, try to use in their case.